Welcome to EPG Pathshala. We are discussing today the course on social policy. The specific module under discussion is Financing Social Policy. My name is Sohini Sengupta. I am a faculty in the School of Social Work at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Whenever we talk about social policy, we have to remember that without adequate financing, all the broader goals and values of rights and entitlements and justice and equality cannot actually be met in reality because we simply would not have the money to create appropriate programs. Adequate financial investment in social protection policies is absolutely necessary to address issues of poverty, income, food security, deteriorating working and living standards, absence of shelter, poor health, and educational attainment. Funds for social programs may be obtained from a variety of sources. Essentially, these funds could be public in nature or be provided by private individuals through their out-of-pocket expenditures. Some basic and universal instruments for creating resources for social policy are taxation, social insurance, external aid, and self-provisioning. Availability of resources to finance social programs is dependent often on the economic performance of a nation. If countries do not have enough money, they simply cannot do any policies, including social policies. The wealth of a nation is, of course, not the only indicator of how much social policy they have. An added requirement is to have the political will to invest in social policy. What determines public spending? Public resources that is invested in social policy is determined essentially by two factors. One is the availability of funds, and the second, the less obvious determinant of public spending is the priorities, the policy priorities of any government. How much the government spends on social services is also determined by the division of labor between state, market, and households, which essentially translates into how much of this welfare creating financing will be done by the government, how much will be done by the private sector, and how much will be done by households and individuals themselves. Public social expenditure is expressed as a share of gross domestic product, which tends to rise with income, which essentially means high income or industrialized countries, especially in the developed north, spend the most amount of money in social sector concerns. However, it is often policy priorities and not national incomes that determine the extent of public spendings. For example, if we look at countries with high-income countries, even within high-income countries, there's a great deal of diversity in terms of the amount of money that is spent on social policies. For example, Sweden spends 30% of its GDP on social security provisions for its citizens, while the United States spends only 16% on social protection and social services. On the other hand, if you look at different countries in this table, you'll realize that some countries which constitute middle-income countries, as well as some countries which are ex-socialist countries, tend to spend more on social policies and social sector, despite not having very high incomes. If you look at the table here, you'll see Latin American countries like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. And you look at the amount of money that they have been spending in the early 2000s in social protection, social insurance, and social assistance, the three different instruments to implement social policies. We also have the example of Vietnam and Mongolia and Indonesia. The point here is, if you see Mongolia and look at the amount of the proportion of government expenditure on social protection, social insurance, and social assistance, you'll realize that Mongolia spends more than many other countries which have higher income, whereas although not as much as Brazil, which essentially shows that it's not just the income that countries have or the wealth that they have, but also the kind of priorities they place on where and which sectors they want to spend their money. The following sources of financing mechanisms are generally used to fund social sector policies. These can be, this is in fact a combination of these instruments are used in most countries of the world. these include self-provision, user fees, which is a kind of cost sharing, prepaid schemes, generalized insurance, indirect taxes, earmark taxes, and direct taxes. These instruments are usually not value neutral in the context of social policy. To try and determine the reason why particular governments should select some instruments and not the other instruments, one way in which a judgment or an evaluation or an assessment is made is based on whether these financial instruments are going to be distributionally progressive, distributionally neutral, or distributionally regressive. Let's try and understand what each of these three categories mean. Progressivity is a measure of the percentage of individual income that is used to pay taxes, which means that a financial instrument is going to be described as a progressive instrument if it does not lead to greater inequality in the society, or if it leads to greater equality in the society. Now, how do we, just to illustrate what that means? In a country, if the rich and the poor both contribute 10% of their income as taxes, what this essentially means is that the rich could be paying more than the poor because rich people earn more. Essentially, that means 10% of a rich person's income is much more in absolute amounts as compared to 10% of the poor person's income. However, a taxation system of this kind is described not as progressive but as neutral. For taxation to be progressive, the rich must pay a larger proportion of their income as taxes. If the rich pay a smaller proportion of their income as taxes, which of course can also result in larger absolute amounts than what poor people pay, because rich people's income might be much more than poor people's. However, such a system of taxation would be described as regressive. If progressivity is one criteria for selecting a financial instrument for funding social policy, solidarity is the other criteria that is used to decide whether a particular social instrument is appropriate for social policy or not. What does the solidarity approach actually mean? For any level of resources, those financial instruments are preferred which are more progressive and which would create more solidarity in society. For example, take the case of a healthy person. A healthy individual can contribute to a generalized insurance system, and this insurance system, which will then use the pooled resources of every healthy individual who have contributed to this pool, and provide health care to any person who happens to be not well at that point in time. Solidarity approach means financing social services through this kind of taxation, which pools collective risks and also tries to use contribution to take care of people who are in trouble. All types of financing mechanisms described so far can be classified based on these two principles, progressivity and solidarity. Usually, self-provisioning and user fees or cost sharing is considered to be among the most regressive, and they create the least solidarity in our society. Direct taxation is considered to be the least regressive and create more solidarity in the society. Well-functioning direct taxation system, which essentially means the rich pay more, not just in terms of absolute amount, but in terms of share of their income that goes for taxation, leads to the most progressive financial instrument. Now, this is a diagram of two inverted triangles that is used to demonstrate the regressivity and the solidarity making capacity of different social instruments. Now, if you look at self-provisioning, user fees, we will explain later why self-provisioning is also called a time burden tax. Essentially, when people provide for certain contingencies from their own resources, time can also be considered a resource, because, for example, staying home and taking care of an elderly person or a sick child because you simply do not have the resources to seek health care essentially means somebody is foregoing some share of their income or time, and that's why self-provisioning includes something called the time burden. So you look at self-provisioning, and then after that comes user fees, then prepaid schemes, generalized insurance, indirect taxes, earmark taxes, and direct taxes. So the most progressive is direct taxes, which is the pointy bit of the pyramid of regressivity. Right on top, time burden is the most regressive instrument. On the other hand, on the solidarity side, you need to see the base of the triangle as the most solidaristic and the peak of the triangle as the least solidaristic financial instrument. Much of the problem in doing social policy is actually the unavailability of fund. Most government can cite the unavailability of the fund as the reason for not doing social policy or not doing or cutting funds from particular types of social protection mechanism. One of the ways in which governments can create better availability of finances for social programs is essentially through sectoral restructuring, which essentially means you still have the same amount of revenues to play with, but you just spend it differently, and your allocation within and between sectors can be different. What essentially, therefore, this means is that countries can shift the burden of allocation between sectors as also within sectors. For example, the budgets of many countries are burdened by defense expenditures and debt servicing. In fact, debt servicing and defense expenditure in many poorer countries eat away quite a lot of their revenues. However, many people believe that widespread conflicts as well as internal conflicts like growing issues of global terrorism and national terrorism can actually be dealt better if we had more pro-poor social policies that create solidarity, cohesion, and integration and political stability in the society. External debt service is often seen as a burden on government. For example, in India, the interest payment on government debt constitutes 25.7% of revenue in 2013. This is, of course, an improvement from the recent past. If you look at, this is a graph that shows the percentage of revenue that goes into interest payment on loans that India has taken. And if you look at the graph, the data starts in 1974 and ends in 2013. In 2013, this was about 25.7%. In some countries, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, this percentage of revenue could be as high as 80%. The other way in which we can increase the availability of public funds for financing social policy is through intra-sectoral reallocation in priority areas like health and education. The way this is done is there is a growing understanding that within social sectors like health and education, quite a large amount of financing may be targeted towards higher level of services. As a consequence, issues like primary education, basic health care, water and sanitation in rural areas, for example, could be neglected as rural people and poorer communities have less voice and less political connections than urban better off groups, which essentially means that services would be provided to these vocal sections of the population while the basic services that is required by the more disadvantaged sections of the population will not be provided. One way of doing this is to reallocate priorities within sectors, within social sectors, to ensure that the services that poorer people use the most get more allocation as against the services which better off people, middle class or upper middle class people use. Now the trouble with this kind of reallocation within a sector is that it's not politically popular. Obviously people who have higher political voice are not going to like the contributions that the government is making towards provisioning of services for them to come down. One way to get out of this situation is to ensure that you are shifting monies from sectors such as defense, for example, into social sector, if you expand the overall money that is spent in social sector, then these forms of priority-based reallocation within sectors will not be seen as taking away of entitlements from some section of population to give it to the other sections. Overall, well-being of a society can be maintained if everyone is entitled to public provisioning and not just selected groups. Targeting it to selected groups makes it more vulnerable for withdrawal, and it also does not create the kind of solidarity that social policy is supposed to create in any society. Now let us try and understand the structure of tax revenues. Where does the tax revenue actually come from? In developing countries, tax revenues are derived from three sources: domestic tax on goods and services, which could be sales tax, excise tax, and so on; foreign trade tax, which essentially means import duties; and direct taxes, which is essentially income taxes on corporates and individuals. In most industrialized high-income countries, income tax from individual constitutes the largest share of tax revenues. Domestic tax on goods and services and social security contribution constitute about a quarter of the entire bundle of tax revenues. What this essentially implies that for social sector spending is, if you are depending on direct taxation for funding our social policies, and we want to do that because it's supposed to be the most progressive and it's supposed to create more solidarity in society, we first have to, we therefore have to have more taxation. Either more taxation or the right kind of taxation in order for that revenue to be generated through taxes. But is that what really happens? Let us look at the different categories of financing instruments, and then we will come back to whether this provisioning through taxation is possible or not possible in the context of India. If we look at self-provisioning and user fees, which is supposed to be not a great financial instrument because it does not create solidarity and it's not progressive, let's try and understand why. Self-provisioning constitutes among the most regressive ways of financing social service or social protection because it includes all kinds of informal components like unpaid care work, selling of assets, becoming debt bonded, increasing in the number of hours that people work. People may be working in unsafe conditions, and they're doing all of that because they have to meet quite a lot of basic social services through out-of-pocket expenditure. User fees or cost sharing require high out-of-pocket expenditure. And if you remember our module on health policy, you'll realize that India is among the country where people are spending a huge amounts of money on healthcare. And the other module on housing, you'll realize that's the other area in which people are spending a lot of money. However, both user fees and cost sharing was introduced and promoted a lot by global financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and many national governments had adopted it in the 1980s and 1990s. There are a lot of empirical studies that have been done since which show that user fees actually lead to adverse consequences as far as equity is concerned, and it has also eventually led to reduced utilization by people who most require those services. If you make the services expensive, people would simply not use them, which essentially means that you might choose to stay unwell rather than approach a hospital where you'd have to share part of the cost of running the hospital. Public insurance, private insurance or public insurance or prepaid schemes are better than user fees. In fact, at the global social policy level, insurance is at the moment promoted as the financial instrument for solving all social policy issues. In countries where people are concentrated in informal sector work, or a large number of people are working in agriculture, therefore, which means that they have unstable working conditions and they have lower income, insurance schemes which require regular contributions from people may have a less redistributive effect, which essentially means that insurance schemes does not, if it is a private insurance schemes, which means you buy it from the market and you maintain it through contribution, it could be a really expensive way of dealing with social needs in case of low income earners. However, if state subsidies are included and public insurance mechanisms are created, then it might become an effective instrument in contexts where a large sections of the population do not have access to stable sources of earning. Indirect taxes on goods and services. Indirect taxes that are, if you've been following the GST debate in India, you'll realize where that comes from. Indirect taxes are levied on consumer goods, services, trades, or specific products. And however, these are not considered to be regressive. These are considered to be regressive, not progressive. This is essentially because lower income groups and women may be spending quite a large share of their income on these goods and services. So what happens is, if you increase the taxes on goods and services, these products become very expensive, and again, many households might have to forego purchasing these commodities and do without it, rather than spend the kind of money that they don't have. Theoretically, one way to make this strategy more neutral and tending towards progressive is to identify the goods that are basic goods or related to basic needs and that poorer communities are likely to use, and exempt these from taxation, say for example food, or cooking fuel, and then increase the rate of taxation for luxury goods like going to cinema or luxury holidays and so on. Though I'm not sure whether going to cinema is a luxury good at the present time. However, if you look at the GST structure, which we will not really discuss in this module, as the argument unfolds, you'll see that there is a staggered rate of taxation on different types of goods and services. The most effective and the most redistributive form of financial instrument for funding social policy is the direct taxes on income and property. This is especially so if there are no exemptions for high income earners. If there are exemptions for high income earners, or if there are special concessions for them, special loopholes for them to get out, then this will no longer be redistributive or a progressive policy. In developing country context, direct taxes, however, account for a very small portion of the revenue. Higher share, and this again comes from the fact that a higher share of agriculture and informal economic activities makes direct taxation difficult. Moreover, tax evasion in countries like India is also very, very common, which leads to poor contribution. If, as a country gets wealthier in terms of its economic growth, and like India has been in the past decades, however, the proportion of revenue that is coming for direct taxation has actually been steadily going down. Better compliance with tax laws and ensuring that the wealthy are not exempted by any means could create direct taxes as one of the best ways of generating revenue for funding social policy. It's important at this point to discuss the changes that are happening in the country in the context of social sector spending through the financial devolution. Now, in India, the spending on social sector is shared between the center and the state government. In recent years, the central government has been playing a larger role in social sector spending by creating a number of what is known as centrally sponsored schemes. Now, under the 14th Finance Commission recommendation, and if you remember our module on devolution, some amount of financial devolution is taking place. Now, what it plans to do, what its recommendation is directed towards, is greater fiscal autonomy of the states by increasing vertical tax devolution of what is called the divisible pool of taxes, and this devolution has been increased from 32% to 42%. Now, Ministry of Finance allocated 5.06 lakh crores as tax devolution in 2015-16, which is higher than 3.38 lakh crores in 2014-15. Now, increase in devolution has actually led to cuts in centrally sponsored scheme. Now, this is essentially because the argument of the central government is, now that more share of the revenue is going to the state, then it is the discretion of the state to spend it on social sector programs that is more responsive and closer to the needs of the local constituencies, rather than the center creating universal types of programs for everybody. Now, what happened really, in real terms, what has happened to social sector spending at the state level? Because this has been the fear. Does devolution lead to, therefore, less spending on social sector? The actual figures don't show any cause for that kind of concern, because between 2014-15, actual money spent in social sector, and 2015-16, which is the revised estimates, or which is not actually spent but which is what is estimated that it is going to be spent. When we look at that, in almost all states in India, the spending on social sector has actually increased proportionately compared to the previous year. If you look at the changing in composition of expenditure and compare it again between actuals in 2014-15 and 2015-16 revenue estimates, even here, with the exception of 2 states, in almost the other states, the proportion of expenditure in social sector has not declined as compared to economic and general. In the reference year, in the graph that you see, most states in India, with the exception of West Bengal and Orissa, have increased their expenditure on social services as compared to total expenditure. This is another data that is available for a few selected states, and a comparison again shows that as a proportion of the GSDP, that is gross state domestic product, that is the state's income, the proportion of resources spent on social sector has again increased and not decreased. This has also happened, and the other thing that has protected social sector spending is by the government, the central government, creating a supplementary budget which has added resources to some of the flagship programs like National Health Mission and the Integrated Child Development Services and the Swachh Bharat mission. As a consequence, the overall money that has been spent in going to be spent in the social sector has not come down, despite the fear that financial devolution might lead to reduced spending in social sector. To conclude, social policies, as we see now, cannot be separated from financial instruments that support them. Resources need to be mobilized such that fiscal space for social policies are expanded and reinforced. That essentially means that you should not say that we can't do social sector spending, we can't do particular type of social policies, or we can't protect poorer people or disadvantaged sections or try to improve people's living standards simply because we cannot afford it. Expenditure policies for social provisioning should be responsive always to the principles of equity, efficiency and democratic accountability. Without holding expenditures to such normative ideals, we could use any number of instruments without taking into account the broader redistributive or justice goals of social policy. When well designed, taxation and social insurance are considered to be the best financing instruments to strengthen democracy and solidarity. And with this, we come to an end on the module on financing social policy. Thank you.